Hi Algebra 1, welcome back. This is our last video for this week. And as you remember, yesterday we finished up chapter 8. Today we're going to move into chapter 9. If you looked on RenWeb and you saw the note handout, you would see that we're actually jumping halfway into chapter 9. Considering our distance learning right now, I thought it best to move forward into solving quadratic equations, which is what we're going to do today. The first few sections of chapter 9 are talking more in depth about graphing parabolas. Now we've already graphed parabolas this year, but there is a lot more still to be learned about that. But I thought, considering the circumstances, it's best for us to skip it for now. If we have extra days at the end of the year, certainly a possible topic to cover. So today you will be in your books on page 555, and we will be talking about solving quadratic equations. Now, we've been factoring quadratics for a while, but now we're going to solve equations. So if you look at the board, there is one rule that I want to discuss to establish how we solve these. And that rule comes into play here. If A times B or AB equals 0, then I know that either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. Makes sense, right? So because anything multiplied by 0 gives me 0, one of those two factors could be 0. Well, we're going to use that rule today as we move into this problem. This is a factored quadratic equation. We're going to start with a slightly easier version of this, and then we'll make it a little bit harder. But just think for 1 second. We are used to seeing them in this form. This is the factored form. But if I were to FOIL this again, I would have a quadratic equation. We now have an equal sign, so we can call it an equation, which also means now I can solve it. But I have a quadratic. The degree or the power of a quadratic is 2. And that exponent of 2 tells me that I could always have up to 2 solutions for each of these problems. So we're going to see as we work through this how that plays out. Okay, so this is my equation. This quantity times this quantity equals 0. Well, I'm going to use this rule that we just talked about and say, well, that means either this chunk has to equal 0 or this chunk equals 0. So I take this one equation and I break it apart into 2 smaller equations. That tells me that 4t plus 1 has to equal 0, or t minus 2 equals 0. So we are now going back into solving equations, and we have 2 mini equations that we just came up with. And we have to remember that we work through the order of operations backwards when we're solving equations. So I'm going to move 1 to the other side and get 4t equals negative 1, t equals negative 1/4 as one of my solutions. Then I have to go over to this other mini equation, add 2 to both sides, and get that my second possibility is 2. So for this quadratic equation, I can have up to 2 solutions, and I have negative 1/4 as a possibility and 2. So I have my 2 solutions. Okay, based on this first example problem, I'm going to give you 2 practice problems that I want you to solve. And remember, we are in 9-4, and this is problem 1. So let me go ahead and clear my board and give you 2 practice problems to do here. Okay, the first one is that. Let's see if I can squeeze this in. Yes, I can. It's really squeezed in. Okay, we've got 2 quadratic equations to try. X plus 1 times x minus 5 equals 0. That's number 1. Number 2, 7n minus 2 times 5n minus 4 equals 0. I want you to pause the video right now and solve both of these equations on your own, and then come back to me whenever you're ready to go over them. Okay, the first thing I need to know that if a product equals 0, that means at least one of the factors equals 0. So that has me set up, based on this rule, 2 mini equations. My first one is x plus 1 equals 0, or x minus 5 equals 0. Well, the nice thing for some of these, and for some of you, you probably don't need to do a whole lot of work on your paper. At this point, you may be able to solve many of them in your head. We get x equals -1 or x equals 5 as my 2 possible answers for this quadratic equation. My second one looks a little bit more complicated, but I still use the same process. If I know a product equals 0, that means at least one of those factors has to equal 0. So I set up my 2 mini equations. That means 7n minus 2 equals 0, or 5n minus 4 equals 0. I apologize for that teeny tiny writing over there. I add 2 to both sides here, and then I divide everything by 7. And I get one of my solutions is 2/7. Over here, I'm going to add 4 to both sides and then divide by 5. If you're still having trouble going through those steps for solving an equation, I do suggest you look in your book and you spend some time on Khan Academy. Those are definitely skills that we should be feeling pretty comfortable with at this point in the year for Algebra 1. Okay, now let's think about this though. If I'm solving an equation, because it has an equal sign, and I get answers, what should my last step always be? I should be plugging them back in. So just to check that my math is right, I would plug these in here. 5 minus 5 gives me 0, thus confirming that this answer would be 0 when I multiply them together as one of the possible answers. Over here, I would also get 0 in that quantity. I would plug this in here and this in there just to confirm that I'm getting 0 as one of those quantities. Okay, so let's move on. Problem number 2 in this section then gives you the quadratic equation in an unfactored form. Well, that's what we just finished up in chapter 8, so this should not be a problem for us. So our first step is to actually factor the quadratic equation. When I have a quadratic equation set equal to 0 already, I'm ready to factor this and then follow the process that we just went over in that example. So if this is my quadratic, I can think through an x form. The nice thing is I don't have a lead coefficient other than 1 here, so I'm just doing an x form. I don't have to do divide and slide or my greatest common factor table. I know that this actually equals x plus 5 times x plus 3. At this point, I don't think I need to take too much time reviewing the x form process. We should be fresh on that. However, now that I have it in a factored form, I know according to my rule, that means either this equals 0 or this equals 0, and I should set up my 2 mini equations from that. X plus 5 equals 0, or x plus 3 equals 0. Remember, I have a quadratic, so I can have up to 2 possible solutions here. Subtract 5 from both sides. I get either -3 or -5 for my answer. Now, how would I check this problem? Slightly different than the last one. The last one was already factored for us. This one is not. However, I would do it the same exact way as I would any equation. I would plug in my values at the beginning. So if I plugged in -5, back to the beginning, -5 squared is 25, minus 40 plus 15 gives me 0. Again, check it mentally or write it out on the paper to make sure. That confirms that solution. However, let's talk about this one. I have a second solution. If I plug -3 in, -3 squared is positive 9, minus 24 plus 15 gives me 0 as well. So both of those solutions have been confirmed by plugging them back in to check. Okay, I'm going to clear this board and give you 2 problems to try. For both of these, they are in the unfactored form, so you have to factor them first and then set each of those smaller factors equal to 0. Let's see. I don't think I'm going to fit them side by side. The second one has a lead coefficient other than 1, so you're going to have to use all of your skills from last chapter here. Okay, we have 2 different equations. This one and this one. I want you to try solving both of these quadratic equations. Pause the video, come back when you're ready, and then we'll go over these answers. Okay, for number 1, I'm not going to set up an X form. I'm just going to trust that you guys have got the X form pattern down. And if I factored these, I know it's m minus 7, m plus 2 equals 0. That's my factored form. But now, according to that rule, that tells me that either this equals 0 or this equals 0. So I have to set those up as 2 mini equations. So I get m equals 7 or negative 2. That one was a little bit easier just to talk through without demonstrating. I'll take more time with the second one just to make sure we're feeling really comfortable pulling all of those skills we learned in the last chapter, adding to this chapter. Okay, in this case, I still need to factor this, but I have this lead coefficient other than 1, so I'm going to need to use one of my shortcut methods. I'm going to use divide and slide. It's my favorite. That's my preference. If you need some extra help and you were feeling like the greatest common factor table is your favorite, please ask me for help. We could Zoom and do some of these using that method for sure. A times C gives me 36, and that goes in my ceiling. My B is negative 15. If I think through the factors of 36, that it could potentially give me negative 15. I know it's 12 and 3 somehow, but I know it has to be negative 12 and negative 3. So let's remember divide and slide. That means I set up my factors like this. But remember, I'm not done. These are not the equations I'm going to set equal to 0. Because of this lead coefficient, I need to go through my divide and slide steps. I'm not done yet. So I do need to divide, reduce, and in that case, that one works out nicely for us. This one does not, so that's where my slide comes in. Now I have my factored forms. Now I'm ready to set each of these equal to 0. If x minus 6 equals 0, that means x equals 6. For this one, I would move 3 to the other side and then divide by 2 and get 3 halves. Again, at this point, you should be feeling very confident solving these mini equations. If you need extra help on that, look in your book, check out Khan Academy, or reach out to me. Okay, that ends today's introduction into solving quadratic equations. You have some suggested book problems to do. They are listed on RenWeb as well as on the note handout for today. And you have one Khan Academy assignment for you, and that is due Friday, May 1st at 5 o'clock to wrap up this very long and involved week of Algebra 1. There was a lot thrown at you this week. I hope you were able to practice and feel confident with each skill, and especially as we move forward into next week, that will include a quiz wrapping up Chapter 8. Okay, that's it for today. Hope you have a great afternoon and a great weekend if you are indeed watching this on Friday.